All right. Well, thank you, folks, for joining us for day 3 of our Conclave 2024. And first off the bat, we have our keynote from the well-known and well-loved Dr. Justin Sledge, entitled The Cunning of Wisdom, the Valentinian Demiurge. Dr. Sledge's work engages with religious studies, specifically in the so-called Western esoteric tradition or Hermetic tradition in religious and philosophical thought. In this line of research, he seeks to grasp the philosophical commitments which underpin the alleged workings of magic, esoteric influence, spirit possession, and alchemy. This field of inquiry brings him primarily into contact with philosophers and intellectuals regrettably disregarded by the modern philosophic canon. And just as a quick note up front, one of the reasons why I was so minded, particularly to hear Dr. Sledge on this topic, is because not only have his productions on Gnosticism been absolutely wonderful, I think it fits very well with our theme. We've been talking about the Gnostic ecclesia, and of course, the idea of wherever two or more are gathered. And when you think about, Gnostic churches that had a shot or could have been a contender, so to speak, in the modern day, you might think of groups like the Ecclesia Gnostica, or perhaps ourselves. In slightly former times, it would be Jules Doinel. In the High Middle Ages, you would have the Cathars. But when you go back to the beginning, the Valentinians, in my opinion, were pretty much the one. And so thinking on that, the best person that we could think of to deliver a talk would be Dr. Justin Sledge. So thank you, Dr. Sledge, for taking us up on this. This is fantastic. And with that, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. And thank you all. Thank you all for having me. And I have to say that it's a real honor anytime I get invited to speak and learn with a community of faith. I'm always more honored. There's always, for me, a great deal more honor involved in learning with people of faith as opposed to learning from academics, because academics, frankly, don't have any skin in the game. The fact that people of faith invite you into their space to learn with you and from you is, to me, a more profound honor than giving some paper at a conference or what have you. So I just want to express my gratitude for being invited into a community of faith and a community of practice to learn together. So my deep appreciation, and it's a real honor to be here. Thank you. All right, let me share my screen. Let's talk a little bit about Valentinus so the talk is called The Cunning of Wisdom, and of course there's a play here, right? That when you think about wisdom, Sophia, the role that Sophia plays in the Valentinian system is quite interesting, and this is a double pun, of course, on the Hegelian notion that spirit works through history, often through people that are unconscious of the fact that spirit is in fact directing them. But all of history, according to Hegel, and Hegel himself is one of the greatest, I think, of the Hermetic philosophers in the Western tradition, the idea that history itself is being guided toward a path of redemption in the Hegelian historical philosophy. And this is a place where I think Valentinianism and Hegel, although he couldn't have known it, that they actually come quite close together in an interesting kind of way, as we'll see in a minute, just through the concept of the demiurge. But this is the part of the talk where I do the thing and talk about how you can't talk about Gnosticism. So there, I just said it. You can't talk about Gnosticism, and we all know that. Blah blah blah. But to be honest, this is the talking about the demiurge is one of the places that does highlight this issue of talking about Gnosticism as a thing that one could be or was. And one of the cases in point here is the concept of the demiurge. Most people who've heard of the concept of the demiurge coming out of Gnosticism are largely going to be taking over that concept from the Apocryphon of John's mythology, specifically the Barbella mythology as it's taken up in the Apocryphon of John. And in that version, I'm sure as everyone knows, we get an evil demiurge, right? We get a malevolent demiurge. And if Gnosticism is known for anything, it's known for that sort of very shocking idea that the world is evil, the world's a prison, physical nature is evil, and that the demiurge is responsible for it. And that's an idea, of course, that was shocking even in its time. This was Plotinus, as we'll talk about in a minute, even found this idea deeply alarming. And that's the idea that most people know of and which passes for Gnosticism. The counterpoint to that, and to make a Michael Williams point for him, is that the real counterpoint of that is the Valentinian Demiurge, which is not evil. The world is not a prison in the Valentinian system. And the way that Valentinus understood the nature of the Demiurge and what the Demiurge is ultimately, his ultimate place in the system is so unlike the position of, for instance, the Apocryphon of John, that it's fascinating that the Apocryphon of John in some ways has won the day, despite the fact that we strongly have good reason to believe that the Church of Valentinus was much more likely to be representative of where people were as Gnostic Christians in the 3rd century, in the 2nd century as well. So it's interesting that idea, the evil demiurge, has won the day, despite the fact that the Valentinian demiurge is so significantly different, and the Valentinians may be more representative of what was we think of sort of as Gnostic Christianity at that time. So this is just a great place to, again, to make like Michael Williams's point for him, that there's so little coherence between even the concept central to the concept of something like the demiurge, that these two can be greatly contrasted to some significant degree. The papyrus there on the left, I'm sure folks recognize, is the Gospel of Truth, which, depending on who you ask, may be the only document penned by Valentinus to have survived, aside from some fragments. So there's some debate about whether the Gospel of Truth, as we have it, is in fact the similar to the one of Valentinus. Valentinus' system himself, from what we can tell, was actually much simpler than the one that's come down to us, either in the Eastern or the Western variant. And both of those seem quite complicated. We think the Valentinian system, the original Valentinian system, was a bit less complicated. And also, I'll be throwing up some great books. I'm sure most of you have all these books on your shelf, but these are some books that I found helpful, and people love book recommendations. I certainly do. This is a great collection of Valentinian texts by Jeffrey Smith. So just to go over a little bit about Valentinianism, this is, I'm sure all folks know this stuff, but just so that we're on the same page, Valentinianism was a species of Christianity associated with Valentinus. They never called themselves Valentinians. In fact, Justin Martyr and other people admit to the fact that they did not call themselves that. So far as we can tell, they just called themselves Christians. And so even the sort of the proto-Catholics have to admit to that. Valentinus himself flourished in the mid-2nd century, and we know his teachings almost exclusively through his disciples. So we don't actually have the original documents that he rewrote, assuming that he did not write the Gospel of Truth as we have it, or that it is a more sophisticated document that's come down to us. And the Valentinian system, as I'm sure folks again know, is characterized by an extremely creative, very complex cosmology, notarized most notably by a system of syzygies. These are pairs that emanate typically in male-female pairs that flow from the original Buthos, the sort of the unknowable father. So far as we can tell, Valentinus himself was probably educated at Alexandria. He may have been from Alexandria. We don't know where he was from originally, but most notably, he does nearly become Bishop of Rome. Now, it's important to point this out. The Bishop of Rome at that time was not the Pope. It was not like he was close in line to be the Pope, especially as we understand the Pope now. However, the Bishop of Rome, even in the 2nd century, was highly sought after by many people. And the fact that he nearly becomes the Bishop of Rome it shows you just how integrated into the Proto-Catholic Church was these so-called Valentinian Christians. Of course, after he fails to become the Bishop of Rome, he's the target of a sustained attack by Irenaeus of Lyon. So if you've ever read the Against the Heresies by Irenaeus, that's the guy that he's most worried about. And he spends most of Book 1 laying into the Valentinian system with sustained polemic. Although I will say that to Irenaeus's credit, once the Nag Hammadi library was discovered, we see that Irenaeus does pretty faithfully represent at least the Western variant of Valentinian teachings. And so Irenaeus's text does preserve in significant degree, despite the fact that he constantly makes fun of Valentinus and the Valentinian system. It does pretty accurately represent what has survived. Valentinus's school was eventually split into a Western, into an Eastern branch. These are represented by slightly different versions of the mythology, especially the flowing out of the syzygies. And we know that in the East, the church survived at least until 388. We know that because in 388 there was a fire. Some people set fire to a synagogue, and when the synagogue was on fire, it actually caught fire to the church next to it, and the church next to it was a Valentinian church. And so, as late as 388, we know that there are Valentinian churches operating at least in the east. By the way, that church was in what is now modern-day Raqqa in Syria. So, which, by the way, was the head of the Islamic Caliphate of ISIS. So I don't recommend going to Raqqa now to go find the remains of the last Valentinian church, but it did survive there until at least 388 and probably survived some deal longer. So we see Valentinianism surviving. If we think about him flourishing in the mid-2nd century and Irenaeus writing in the 180s, centuries later, 2 centuries later, there are functioning Valentinian churches. We don't have any idea when Valentinian churches ceased to function. But at any rate, it functioned for several centuries after that. So why focus on the Demiurge? Why, of all the things to focus on in the Valentinian system, why focus on the Demiurge? And I have a couple of reasons why I want to focus on it. And I'll turn to those, but of course on the left we have obligatory William Blake art. Can't do anything about Gnosticism without somehow putting in pictures of William Blake. Speaking of the cunning of reason, William Blake managed to become a Gnostic all unto himself without seemingly knowing anything about Gnosticism, which is, again, pretty impressive. I guess the main reason why I want to focus on the Valentinian Demiurge is that, again, there's a stereotype of Gnosticism that it is a world-hating, cosmos-hating system that is underscored and underwritten by a malevolent demiurge who creates the physical world as a kind of prison. And what I'd like to argue and suggest, I suppose, is that for whatever reason, that more shocking variant of Gnosticism has won the day, despite the fact that we have every reason to believe that the Valentinian system was far more representative of where people were in this kind of adopting this kind of mythology. So it's interesting that Valentinus knew about the idea of the malevolent demiurge, and the Valentinian school rejected it. In fact, in the letter to Flora, the writer there says only completely thoughtless people have this idea, and they refer to it as an idea completely in error. So it's interesting here that, and of course I know folks know that Plotinus also lays into this idea in the Enneads, and what's interesting here is that Valentinus, the Proto-Catholics, and Valentinus all agree that the idea of the malevolent demiurge was a bad idea. They think it is they think of it as a heterodox idea. And what's interesting to me again about that is that this is the idea that's carried the day. If you ask people what Gnosticism is, they're going to tell you something about a malevolent demiurge. And I think that that's an unfortunate way that history has shaken itself out. And so focusing today a little bit on the Valentinian demiurge is perhaps more of an emphasis to fly that flag a little higher and maybe begin to turn that narrative around a little bit. But also this really upends, I think, stereotypes, both so-called from the Proto-Catholics, but also from the pagans. Plotinus is stereotyping of the Gnostics as world-hating and affirming the idea of a malevolent prison world. I think that these are stereotypes largely foisted upon Gnosticism that are not inherent to it. So let's talk about how the Valentinian demiurge comes into being. And folks who know a good bit about the Apocryphon of John version, they'll see the obvious contrast, and I'll point some of those out as we go. Of course, Einar Thomason's book, The Spiritual Seed, is the single best study of the Valentinian Church, the spiritual seed being a reference to the church. And so if you ever get the chance to pick this book up, unfortunately it's published by Brill, so you need to, you'll need as much money as you'll need to win the auction for the Nag Hammadi library cover to get it. I think this book is about $160 from Brill or something like that, but it is the single best study of the Valentinians, and Einar Thomason is without a doubt the best scholar of the Valentinian Church. So I'm not going to rehearse the entire Valentinian system, because we would be here for 6 years or something trying to go through each one of these emanations. But what's most important to know is that there is a system of 30 emanations that emerge from the primordial father, the primordial profundity, who mates with silence and ultimately through an incredibly complicated process of 30 syzygies, we kind of come down to the realm where Sophia comes into existence down there toward the end of that process. The Eastern and Western variants of Valentinianism don't quite agree on exactly how all these syzygies come to pass. There is disagreement among them, especially on the emergence of Jesus and the Holy Spirit. So I don't know where you fall on that debate, but there is a slight difference in how the Eastern and Western versions of the Valentinians work this out. But what they do agree upon, this is where they do come back together, is that Sophia, wisdom, she is united with an intense desire. So her intense desire is to know the primordial father, and that is somehow inappropriate. Now, what's interesting about this, to me at least, is it's not really clear exactly what's inappropriate about it. It seems like, unlike in the Apocryphon of John myth, where Sophia wants to create something without her consort, or without the express permission of the higher realms, here it just seems like there's a kind of an inappropriate intensity to her curiosity. And perhaps it's the distance between her and the primordial father, or that only the first emanation knows the primordial father, and therefore no one else is allowed to know the father down through the other, 29 emanations. There's something about this, the intensity of this desire. And that inappropriate, passionate curiosity actually causes Sophia to be split, which is interesting, again, unlike the Apocryphon of John myth, where she's cast out of the pleroma. And what happens in the Valentinian mythology is that she's split, and the higher Sophia stays within the pleroma, but the lower Sophia, referred to as Sophia Akamot, which is a corruption of a Hebrew word. In fact, it's just the word chokmah, which means wisdom. So her name is Wisdom. So Sophia Akamot is cast out of the pleroma, and it's Sophia Akamot that becomes sort of the star of the rest of the development. Now, why she's kind of referred to as Sophia Akamot or Chokhmah Sophia is not clear. I don't know why you'd redouble her name in Greek and in Hebrew, but at any rate, that is the way that it plays itself out. So the rest of the drama of the system is going to be focusing on what happens to Sophia Akamot. So outside the pleroma, Sophia goes through a range of emotions, and her emotions ultimately, her emotional expressions give rise to the primordial substances that will ultimately go into the creation of our cosmos. So her anguish and her sense of lack becomes the left, and that ultimately will become matter. Eventually, she kind of goes through a process of ceasing this desire to reunite with the Father. She repents of that desire. And once she repents of that desire, that becomes the right. And that right side becomes suke, becomes soul. And eventually, in the process of her repenting, the primordial father does take notice of her and sends Christ outside of the pleroma to comfort her and provides her with gnosis. She achieves gnosis as an act of mercy from Christ, and that allows her to know the truth about the Father. In some sense, it's by giving up hope of knowing the Father that she's given the grace of that knowledge. So it's an interesting kind of mode of a mode of kenosis, where it is her kenosis that gives rise to her achieving gnosis, and it's through that grace that she's able to give rise to the spiritual substance, and that spiritual substance is going to be what is going to ultimately allow human beings to achieve gnosis and achieve redemption. But one of the things that's going to be important here is that the spiritual substance that is the result of her achieving gnosis doesn't have form. It's sort of a unformed spiritual stuff, and that unformed spiritual stuff is going to have to be shaped into something that can be redeemed. And so this is where the system really gets kicked into high gear. So what we have matter, inchoate matter, which is incapable of salvation. It's incapable of gnosis. We have soul, which is capable of free will. In fact, it just seems to be free will for the Valentinians. And then we have spirit, which is capable of incapable of salvation. Now, depending on exactly who you're reading, in some versions of the Valentinian system, people are born into one of these. So either you're a psychic person, you're a material person, a hylake person, or you're a spiritual person. And only those spiritual people are capable of salvation. In some systems, it seems like there's a process of reincarnation where you kind of get reincarnated and you might, I don't know, I always imagine it kind of like a gambling game where depending on what kind of being you get, you're capable. Although in other mythologies, it seems like everyone sort of is made of all three, and it depends on how you use your free will about whether or not you will achieve gnosis and salvation. On the right-hand side, by the way, is a gravestone that actually contains good evidence, the bridal chamber language of the Valentinians. So this is probably, I've seen this in real life. You can see it if you go to Rome. This is a gravestone probably of a Valentinian Christian. So it's quite cool, quite cool artifact to have survived. It's one of the few material pieces of Gnosticism aside from manuscripts which have survived. At any rate, once Sophia has sort of generated the three primordial constituents of reality, of the cosmos, then we have to get on to the business of creating all this. Why? Because Sophia can't do it. Sophia Achamout is a spiritual being, and because she's a fundamentally spiritual being, she just can't interact with either Tsuke or with Hule, with mind or with substance, and so she has to create a kind of intermediary between her and the larger world. And to do that, she creates the Demiurge. Now, what's interesting about the Demiurge here, again, unlike the Demiurge in the Apocryphon of John myth, is that he is not completely in the Apocryphon of John myth, he's an abortion, is what the language uses. This is really important. He's not an abortion in the Valentinian myth. He's a necessary part of salvation. He's simply a constituent part of how the process has to go, because in order for the spiritual substance, the spiritual seed, the church, to achieve salvation, it has to be formed into something coate. In order to form it into something coate, Sophia has to create the Demiurge. So the Demiurge is created in order to achieve salvation for the spiritual substance. It's not an afterthought. It's not a malevolent, it's not a mistake. There's no result of a cosmic tragedy. In fact, one could argue that it's the inverse of the Apocryphon of John, where in the Apocryphon of John, the Demiurge is a cosmic tragic event that traps human beings at some level in this world. The Demiurge for the Valentinians is an absolutely necessary part of the plan of salvation. There is simply no salvation in this realm, according to the Valentinians, without the work of the Demiurge, but also the ongoing work of the Demiurge, because as we'll see in a minute, the Demiurge's chief job right now is as a sort of custodian of this realm, and most of that consists of fighting the devil and the demonic hordes, which are constantly assailing us. So as I mentioned, the spiritual seed or the substance, the spiritual substance, it lacks form. And in order to do that, Sophia Achamout emits this entity, the Demiurge, and she emits him in the form of the primordial father. So remember, she's gotten some gnosis of the primordial father, and she emits a being that is the most like the primordial father possible. And the Valentinians apparently were very comfortable, or at least comfortable with the idea of referring to the Demiurge as king and father and God. So that was language they were totally okay with, that you could refer to the Demiurge as God, something that you certainly couldn't do in the Apocryphon of John myth. And the Demiurge, the Demiurge himself is a totally psychic substance. He's a psychic substance, and he can mediate between both matter and spirit. He can sort of mix them together to create the world. But what's important about the Demiurge is he's not the primordial father. He is a sort of a coarse version, is what the Valentinians referred to him, and in his coarseness, he's not able to rise to the spiritual level, as we'll see in just a moment. Also, he's ignorant. Because his nature is fundamentally spiritual, or psychic rather, he doesn't know his origins. He doesn't know that he's the emission of a spiritual being, of Sophia. And so all of the language we get of where he says things like, I am the God alone, there is no other, that kind of Hebrew Bible language, yes, that's the kind of language that we see also in the Apocryphon of John, where where Saklas or the Yaldabaoth declares that he is God alone and there's no else. they're both ignorant, but notice this ignorance is not malevolent ignorance. It's actually very innocent ignorance. And it's not his fault. He simply can't know the nature of where he came from because he's of an incompatible substance of his origin. And therefore, the declaration that he is God is kind of true in this way. He is truly the God of this realm, the father of this realm, and it's born out of an actual just ignorance, a kind of childish ignorance that's not and ultimately his fault. So the purpose of the demiurge, and this is where it comes into the idea of the cunning of reason, the cunning of Sophia, the demiurge acts a bit like a puppet. Now, I'll come back to this more in a minute, to the degree to which the demiurge has free will or not, and it's seemingly contestable in the literature. But the purpose of the demiurge, the Valentinian demiurge, is to effectively operate as the hands of Sophia. She uses the demiurge as the mechanism by which to create a world, our world, in which salvation of the spiritual seed is possible. And he's often described again, as the hands of wisdom. So in some sense, I don't know, I always imagine it as a bit like a spiritual or a psychic robot. The psychic robot controlled at some level by Sophia, although we'll see in a minute, he'll get redeemed too. So there's some element he must have free will. And remember, if you'll call back for a second ago, the psychic element is associated with free will. So to what degree he's totally free isn't clear. In some literature, it seems like he's completely controlled by Sophia. And sometimes he seems like he has his own free will. I think that it's a very just confused thing. Maybe it's a hermeneutical problem for someone to fix. So I mentioned this. Yeah, I'll mention it just in a second. So as in lots of other, it's a picture of Irenaeus. I'm sure he's real popular around here. It's I've been it's again like when I have a chance to work on Gnosticism, I get the chance to read Irenaeus, and I will say that he's so snarky in a way that I really appreciate. Like he has a kind of like Reddit sense of humor where he just like likes to make fun of people, and this he's just snarky in a way. I don't know. I wish we had more snark. We have bitter, cynical academics, but we don't have snarky ones. There's something somewhat snarky about Irenaeus that I do appreciate. At any rate, what ends up happening is that the demiurge ends up creating a group of angels. There may be more of them, but there are certainly 7 of them. Notice again, they're not archons. There are archons. There will be archons in the system, but the angels that rule over the planetary spirits or rule over the planets in the Valentinian system they're benevolent. They're actually there and they're there for good. They're psychic creatures, and they're there actually not to enslave us, but they're actually there to help us. And what ends up happening is that insofar as the Valentinian demiurge is a mirror image of the ineffable Father, he creates a kind of inverse pleroma. So he generates sort of like another world. So imagine sort of 2 triangles, right? We have the triangle of the upper pleroma and the lower pleroma, and they're both butting up against 2 levels of Sophia. Our world is a kind of not so great version of the upper pleroma. It is a world emitted in the same kind of way with the male-female pair system and all that stuff. But in some sense, it's a mirror image, a coarser mirror image, but a kind of mirror image of the upper pleroma. Now, again, he's not doing that because he wants to. He's doing that because Sophia is engineering the system that way. He's doing it through, he's accomplishing it through her machinations, of which he is completely ignorant. And we'll see that ignorance on full display in just a minute. Now, I want to point out, this is actually really close to Plato. Really, really close to Plato. If you've read the Timaeus, you'll remember, right, that in the Timaeus myth, the craftsman, the demiurge, looks toward the forms, which are completely spiritual, and he shapes matter the best he can with the use of the spiritual world. But matter simply isn't capable of taking on complete perfection, the world of the forms, and therefore what we get is a maximally perfect world. We don't get a perfect world because the forms are perfect and they simply can't take, the matter simply can't take the perfection of the forms. But according to Plato, we are living in the best of all possible worlds. That's an idea I think that people don't really get from Plato, but it is the best possible world the demiurge could have made. That's also true for Valentinus. This world is the absolute best world that could be made, given the fact that Sophia has to work through the demiurge And basically what he has to work with is the remnants of the emotional detritus of Sophia, both in her isolation and her sadness, but also in our other feelings that become the psychic stuff. He has to put all that together, being operated again through Sophia, and we are living in the best of all possible worlds. Why is it the best of all possible worlds? Because it is a world engineered for our salvation. That's such a different vision of the world than, for instance, the Apocryphon of John, where this is a world meant to be escaped. Like we're here, we're aliens in this world. We need to, the Gospel of Thomas says, become passersby, just like get out of here, right? That's not the case for Valentinus. The world is imperfect, sure, but that's not because of any malevolence. It's simply because this is the best world that could have been made given the situation at hand. So here again, we're much closer, I think, to Plato, and we're much closer to the Hermeticists, frankly. I think that the ancient Hermeticists would be very close to something like this, this way of thinking about the world as a kind of miracle, and it's engineered for salvation. And in some ways, I would say this is even a more, Valentinus's vision of the world is even more optimistic than the Hermeticist, because in the Hermetic worldview, remember, the planets are demons. They are malevolent archons. They are there to try to stop you from getting out at some level. They are there like they impressed upon your soul at birth all kinds of malevolent stuff. That's not the case in the Valentinian system. So again, we have this idea that Hermeticism is like sort of hip and positive and world-affirming, and Gnosticism is like bad and not world-affirming, and everything is, the Demiurge is bad. I would argue that Valentinian system is the most optimistic of all of these systems. More optimistic than, I would say, ultimately, even the Hermeticist, the Corpus Hermeticum system, and much closer to Plato. Much closer to Plato. At any rate, we now jump to the main star of the show. The main star of the show is not Sophia, not the Demiurge, it's us. You are, depending on, again, the system that you want to get from Valentinus, you are the spiritual substance. You are the spiritual substance that is inside of a body made from hule, and also you have the free will, the mind, made from the psychic material, and we are the nexus of all those things. Animals, for instance, are bodies and psychic stuff. Water bottles are just matter stuff. We are all three combined. And what's interesting about that is that we're superior to the Demiurge. The Demiurge is all psychic. So in some sense, we are better off than the Demiurge. And that again shows you this is a pretty benevolent system, all things told. The point of creation is the salvation of the spiritual seed. That's it, right? That is the whole work of creation for the Valentinians. So as I pointed out, it's not a prison. This is not a place to escape from. It's a place from which you ascend, and you ascend through coming through Gnosis, knowing the truth about the formation of this world and how it came into being. Human beings, again, through Sophia, are created by the Demiurge and the angels. The angels work with Demiurge to create the human being. This is also interesting because this is an idea probably coming over from Judaism. Judaism also had the idea that God did not directly make the human being, that the angels were all sort of making every little tiny part of the human being along with God. So this may be the case where Valentinus is actually leaning on some contemporary Jewish thinking about the composition of the human being. And once the human being is formed, Sophia smuggles in, unbeknownst to the Demiurge, the spiritual seed, and that animates us. What's interesting about that is that as soon as the human being sort of comes into existence in their fullness, the Demiurge knows something's up. The Demiurge kind of realizes, this is sort of the first, like, hold on, something's going on here. The Demiurge and all the angels are awed at the human being because they realize dimly at first, but it'll be more clear in just a moment, that the human being is somehow better than them. And so there's this beautiful moment where the first human beings are formed, the first human being is formed, and the Demiurge and the angels are sort of all like, holy shit, like, what is this thing? Even the Demiurge realizes we are something special over and against even the creator. Now, what's going on in all of this as well? What's going on here in the meantime? Once the human being is created, well, At the very end of the process of the generation or the emanation of the negative emotions that were had by Sophia, at the very end of that, at the most horrifying end of Hule, is the devil. The demons and Satan emerge from matter. So this is where you do get a little bit of that sort of good old-fashioned dualism, where matter is at the very end of it, at the very worst representation, it is dominated by the devil, by Satan, and the archons. But note here, the archons are not the planets. The planets, again, are good angels. They're there to help us. And in fact, the major thing that in the Valentinian system that the Demiurge and the angels do is they beat back the demonic hordes that are constantly attacking the human being. So they're locked in a kind of quasi-Manichaean struggle over and against the world of the archons and the devil. But again, notice here, the devil, Satan character, and the archons, the demonic archons, are not controlling everything. They're irritating, and they do lead you into temptation. They do tempt you into doing things that allow your free will to go in the direction of physical hylic desires, and they can damn you, but they're not the world prison garden, the prison wardens, the way that they are in other mythologies. So tempting, yes. Dangerous, yes. But they're not powerful in the same kind of way. And a big part of what the Demiurge does at this point is beat them back and sort of engage in a pitched battle with the demons. Now, in order to try to stop that process, what does the Demiurge do? He gives us the law. He tries to generate a system of laws that will make us good, and that is the Mosaic Law. The Mosaic Law is a way of training free will so that free will, once it gets trained, will do the right thing, and you will not be tempted by the archons. Now, the way that the Demiurge does this is by giving the law and saying, if you don't do it, you will be punished with death. You will die. I will kill you if you do not do this. So the Demiurge, with the permission of the primordial father, takes upon himself the right of judge and executioner. And the idea is the law is a mechanism, the Mosaic Law is a mechanism by which for human beings to train themselves to be leaning more into their psychic natures as opposed to their physical nature. They can't lean them, the Mosaic Law cannot lean them into their spiritual nature because the Demiurge doesn't have the ability to let people know that because he doesn't know that. But this is where death comes from in the Valentinian system. It's a mechanism by which to make you your better self, but it also introduces death into the Valentinian system. So it is a hedge against the satanic assault. It does give you a way to train yourself to make your free will good, at least good, limited good, but it does not allow you a spiritual breakthrough. And this is where you get the sort of Pauline stuff where it says like, look, yeah, if you follow it, it'll make you okay. But it's ultimately the attaching yourself to the Mosaic Law is death. And so the Valentinians adopt that in a certain, that Pauline idea in a quite interesting way. This is also another place to point out where the Hebrew Bible is very central to the Valentinian ideas. They never reject the Hebrew Bible. In fact, the Valentinians quote the Hebrew Bible in some places more than other New Testament texts do. So they're very comfortable with the Hebrew Bible. In fact, they think of the prophets as the voice of the Demiurge, urging people on to be good and to be like lean into their psychic natures, which again is still a hedge against the hylic nature. And so the prophets get a lot of quotations in Valentinian literature. Also, by the way, philosophy was introduced by the Demiurge as a way of helping the Greeks. The Israelites, the Jews got the Mosaic Law, the Greeks got philosophy. And philosophy is just another mechanism by which to train your soul. And I'm sure he's thinking of things like Stoicism, Platonism, other kinds of Neoplatonism, not quite Neoplatonism, maybe Middle Platonism, but he's thinking of these ideas of something like Stoicism as a way of paideia, a way of training your soul in order to be more psychic as opposed to being more hylic. And so philosophy and the Mosaic Law in the Valentinian system are similar. They're revelations from the Demiurge by which to lessen the satanic assault in order to hopefully, get you to be, more psychic, which is still better than being more hylic. So this is an interesting place where, for instance, Valentinus is very distinct from Marcion. You'll know Marcion really dislikes the Hebrew Bible. He thinks of the Hebrew Bible as a terrible document. He thinks of the creator of the Hebrew Bible as being demonic, and that Christ is the authentic God, and Marcion has nothing good to say about the Hebrew Bible. Notice here that Valentinianism is actually much closer to orthodoxy, or what will become orthodoxy. So the Valentinian system, much more comfortable with the Hebrew Bible because it is a kind of Wittgensteinian ladder. It's one mechanism up the situation to help you protect yourself against this ongoing demonic assault from the Hylic realm. But of course, this would not be Christianity if Christ wasn't coming. And Christ does come. Thank you, Jesus. And what Jesus does is comes through and he does the whole Gnosis thing. So we all know that at some level, it's Christ that comes and reveals the truth about all of this. What's interesting about this, vis-a-vis the Demiurge, is that at Jesus's baptism, the Demiurge himself realizes the truth. And in fact, it's sort of, he gets it both ways. He's looking down, he sees the Jesus moment and realizes, I'm not the only God. And at the same moment, Sophia whispers in his ear, hey, just so you know, you're not the only God. The system is there's a bigger picture here. And it's at that moment that the Demiurge himself attains gnosis. Now, it's a limited gnosis because he's not composed of a spiritual nature. And so it is a psychic kind of gnosis. It's kind of a tier down, but he does achieve the best he can. He does realize that he is not the God of this world, and of course that there's another world above him. And he does sort of enjoy his own transformation. And the eighth heaven, just above the seventh, becomes a kind of paradise. In that eighth heaven, he now, once he's done fighting the devil at the end of time and all the spiritual seed is redeemed, he will get to have repose in that sort of paradise. It's a psychic paradise. It's not as good as being up in the pleroma, but he does achieve a kind of gnosis. Again, this is a fate unimaginable in other forms of Gnosticism, where the Demiurge is simply a thing to be defeated and overcome. Here, at Jesus' baptism, he's achieved gnosis, and he becomes sort of a self-conscious custodian of this realm. In fact, again, depending on the Valentinian system, some of us who are just psychic people, we will go and join the Demiurge in the eighth heaven. When we die, we achieve our kind of second-rate gnosis, and we get to go stay there with him. In other systems, the psychic element of yourself will go and dwell in the eighth heaven, and the spiritual seed, if it's redeemed, will go back into the pleroma. So it depends on the system, but in some sense, it's kind of a heaven that gets generated. And when people think about going to heaven, it's kind of something like that. So what happens now to the Demiurge? For the rest of time, the Demiurge is now the self-conscious custodian of our realm and is engaged in a pitched battle with the forces of the devil in order to basically fight the demons and the devil off long enough that the spiritual seed can be redeemed. And once the spiritual seed is redeemed, I think everything recedes back in sort of a sort of Stoic style conflagration and epicosis, and that all recedes back to the eighth sphere, and that is the elimination of basically our realm. Matter will be destroyed in the conflagration, psychic substance will be left, and it will be sort of a ring outside of the pleroma, sort of right outside of the totality of the pleroma will be a psychic ring around it, and the Demiurge will dwell in that sort of psychic ring along with all the rest of the psychic substances when they are redeemed. Why am I doing all this? Why focus so much on this? This is sort of my last points I'll make before I open it up and we can have a conversation and chat a little bit more about this. I think the concept of the Demiurge, especially the malevolent Demiurge, has just totally distorted our vision of second century Christianity. I think that the Apocryphon of John's version has become so popular that it's distorted, I think, the way that the largest and most successful Gnostic church actually thought about all of this. And so that vision of the malevolent Demiurge, which we can talk more about why it's so popular, the sort of the Matrix version or something like that, that idea has really caught the popular imagination. And now that has become the poster child for Gnosticism. When we know that the most successful variant of Gnosticism, the one that was most integrated into the ecclesia, was this. This was the one most integrated into the ecclesia. And so it seems to me that this should be the one most representative of ancient Gnosticism. much more than any other variant. So, secondly, this is also just much more normative at the time. If you think about Jewish ideas like Merkava mystics ascending into the heavens, the Hermeticist view of getting into the heavens and bypassing the demons on their way up, and even Proto-Catholic views, the Valentinian system is actually just closer to the majority view. It's much more normatively, well, normal. And it should not be surprising it was popular because it fits in far better with the intellectual landscape that we have. Also, I think it's worth pointing out that when Gnosticism was attacked, both by Plotinus and by the Proto-Catholics, they attacked the Apocryphon of John variant typically and said all Gnostics believe some version of that. And that's exactly what Plotinus does when he attacks the Gnostics. I think he's strawmanning the Gnostics. I think that Plotinus knows, he had to have known there were other variants of it, specifically this Valentinian variant of it. And I think what we have in history, both in Irenaeus and also in some of the other ecclesiastical church fathers, but also in Plotinus, a kind of straw man attack. And that's unfortunate because, again, it's distorted our vision of what second century, third century, fourth century Gnosticism looks like. And the last point I'll make about this is I think that for many people that want to identify with Gnostic Christianity, I think that Valentinianism gives people a far more monistic, and the system is largely monistic to some degree, a much more monistic, or at least a less dualistic narrative with engaging with this demiurgic mythology. And I think that's just, if you're going to be religious and spiritual about being a Gnostic, having options that limit you beyond the Apocryphon of John myth, the fact that that's very popular and that's what seems to be what most people know. This is just, I think, an interesting and beautiful alternative to that mythology that maintains all the same Baroque wonderfulness of the emanations and the syzygies and the demiurge and all that. But I think it provides, one, a more authentic and helpful glimpse into what was clearly a popular belief that lasted at least into the 4th century, but also a less dualistic vision of Gnosis and of the cosmology that is associated with Gnosticism. So I hope that this sort of exploration, one, I hope it wasn't boring because I'm sure many of you are more learned than I am on these topics, but I hope this also just gives you a glimpse into the fact that this is a much more sophisticated system or groups of systems or group of mythologies than we often think, and that the Valentinian system, I think, is especially beautiful. There's a high degree of elegance to this system, and it'd be the kind of place where I'd encourage you to, pick up your Irenaeus or pick up your Gospel of Truth or other text and take a look at the Valentinian system and really focus in on the role of the demiurge and appreciate that the Valentinian system is, I think, quite lovely and quite spectacular. And there's a beautiful idea that all of this world, as opposed to being created as a prison, that the world was actually created as a sort of an experiment or as a theater of salvation. And to understand the universe as a theater of salvation, I think, is a far more beautiful idea and a far more spiritually rich idea than often we give Gnosticism credit for. So thank you all. Thank you all for coming with me and chatting a little bit today about the Valentinian Demiurge.
Thank you. That was excellent. We've got about the, I'd say, the 10-2 mark to do some questions and discussions. And being as I have so few perks when it comes to this job, I'm just gonna outright ask the first question. It's a privilege of being the church's janitor, I suppose. So I think one of the things we've talked about over the years, and I mean, one of them, one of the questions I would have is already kind of answered. We've had a few scholars who have come to talk to us about Sethian Gnosticism, the Apocryphon of John, namely Karen King and Zlatko Plesia. And so I usually hit them up with the dualism or monism question. You've already kind of dealt with that. So I guess I would, by the way, I think this talk's going to be an instant classic. Karen King is one of our most popular talks, and I think this is going to probably knock it into the number 2 spot. It was a really good talk.
Thank you.
So I guess it's fair to say, we have a lot of folks inside the church community and also in the periphery who are practicing esotericists, and you can't kind of have an engagement with any kind of Western esotericism without having some basic interaction with Western astrology. But one of the conundrums that people have had in reconciling that, particularly inside a church that embraces the label of Gnostic, is that some of the Gnostic stuff, particularly the Sethian stuff, has a very anti-astrological view, or at least implies in some of its stuff that no, this isn't good. You shouldn't follow it, right? Like you're essentially you're being bound by the planets. They're not your friends. Some folks have argued that it's a little bit of Western esoteric or spiritual Aikido. I've made that argument to, be aware of all information possible, right? So astrology, divination, those type of things has its use. So would it be fair to say, kind of in that mirror, or that reverse mirror of Sethianism, that Valentinianism is positive on something like astrology or divination, perhaps?
That's a good question. I didn't, when I was reading through the text to prepare for this, I didn't notice anything particularly, but what I think it is amenable to the sort of late classical idea that the gods communicate, uh, they communicate via the stars. And this is the two theories of astrology in the ancient world. One is the causal theory that the god is, or the gods are actually causing things via the stars, and the other is that the stars are simply signs and they're communicating what's coming. Sort of like the weather, right? If you look far enough that way, you'll see a dark cloud coming, the rain is coming. Well, if you look up and you can see kind of what's coming. And the idea was, at least in some of the Stoics and Jewish astrology, was that the gods actually do that because they're benevolent. They're letting you know what's coming. And in their benevolence, they're communicating via the stars to let you know what's happening. I think that a version of that would be amenable to the Valentinian system, because again, the stars, unlike in the Sethian system, are they're not evil archons. They're angels out there fighting on your behalf. And so the idea that they could be communicating to you through their alignments seems completely reasonable. It's at least consonant. But again, the early church is all over the place when it comes to astrology. The church in general has always been all over the place when it comes to astrology. It's never really made its mind up exactly about where it lands on all that. Judaism too. But I can imagine there being a positive view of astrology. And this would be an interesting thing to talk to Chris Brennan about, and think about sort of how that would relate. But I suspect that one could shoehorn in an astrological practice with a Valentinian worldview, much more so than the Sethian worldview. That doesn't make any sense to me.
Could I take on Christopher Warnock's view on that?
Sure, please.
Oh, yeah. So I've been studying with Christopher Warnock astrology for quite a few years now. And that's very much the philosophy that he teaches in his classes, that the angels of the planets are benevolent guides giving us support and kind of the what's up.
Yeah, and that's that insofar as people like Ficino and the sort of classical Renaissance folks, insofar as they engage with non-elective astrology, that's what they believe too. Was that they're communicating via the signs, were sort of, you read the heavens in the same way that you read the book of nature, and God's benevolence is programmed into the book of nature. And when you read the book of nature and do science, you're actually that process is an act of worship. That the scientist science is a kind of piety by reading the book of nature, which I find that the idea of science a far more compelling idea than the instrumental use of reason. But thank you, Angie, for that rejoinder. I appreciate that.
Brad's got his hand up.
Hello, Your Eminence. Thanks for letting me ask a question. Justin, I was wondering, and maybe I missed it, or it may not necessarily be a specific component of this presentation, but I'm wondering how the Egyptian religion and philosophy impacted Alexandrian Gnosticism and the Demiurge becoming so malevolent, even though all of that was separated by 400 or 500 years?
This is a big. This is a place where I have to say that I'm not quite sure. With the malevolent demiurge, I think we have good reason to know how that happened. That's that's established really well that the Egyptians associated Yahweh with the god Seth, and so the demonization of Yahweh, which is sort of part of the polemics between the Jewish population and the Egyptian population, that was cooking in the mix already in the 3rd century. That was already cooking, and so by the time that you get the infusion of what we call the Sethian tradition, the spiritual framework for that was already there, and sort of background polemics between indigenous Egyptians and the Jewish population living in Alexandria. A third of the population of Alexandria were Jews. So the malevolent demiurge stuff, we have a pretty good understanding of where that comes from and those kind of polemics. But in terms of the Valentinian system itself, it does, the system is generated from an Ogdoad, and it mirrors very much the kind of stuff that we do see in indigenous Egyptian astrology. And so I would suspect that Valentinus is leaning on, and goes back to Sean's question actually, is leaning on indigenous conceptions of the heavens as systems of syzygies and as Ogdoads, as a way of generating his pleroma. So I do think that there is an indigenous Egyptian influence. And this is why I said I think he's educated at Alexandria. I think he's picking up on a lot of this stuff. So I do think that is a case where some indigenous Egyptian spirituality and religious cosmology is working its way into the not Sethian system, into the Valentinian system. It's a great question.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much.
We've got a question from earlier in the chat from Tom, talking about the Mandean analog to the Demiurge, and this is way outside of my thing because I know squat about Mandeanism, about whether or not their take is that the Demiurge is evil.
Yeah, it's split. Some Mandean texts seem to think that the Demiurge is evil, and some not. So it depends on what text you're looking at. So it's split. And I'm going to be doing a whole series on Mandeanism on the channel because it's just so complicated. But yeah, the Mandean mythology is not consistent on that. It depends on which text you consult, which shows me, I think, that there was early on in the Mandean system, them trying to reconcile a bunch of stuff. And what we have in a lot of Mandean literature is not a kind of canon, but a wrestling with material. And ultimately they preserved it all, but it doesn't give us a clear vision of the world. But the world is definitely, in the Mandean system, is the physical world is bad. And you do want to escape it to the Manadechia, and you do want to escape this world, but you do have to maintain a strict regime of ritual purity, and that takes the form, of course, in basically the daily baptisms, which are all the more tragic considering that they've been basically evicted through conflict and other means from their ancestral homelands in Iraq and Iran.
I think there's also a little bit of self-limiting there because, as I recall, that they don't do conversion.
Yeah, they don't do conversions. It's like the Zoroastrians, but yeah, it's and the Samaritans. They have very strict rules about incest. So a lot of these groups share the idea that that if you marry someone and get divorced, you can't remarry anyone of that clan because you've been married to them, and having sex with someone will be constitutive of incest. And so this greatly limits who can get married because these groups are already very, very small. And so it's even more self-limiting by some of the legal procedures by which marriages can take place.
I was going to say, if my wife divorces me, I'm pretty sure she's not going to want to have any contact with my family. I'm not sure she wants to have contact with my family currently. So, let's see here. Just got to keep up on the chat. Yes, and the Druze.
And someone mentioned the idea of this. Tom mentioned this about the idea of death happening before Moses. This is something I noticed too. Like, hold on, if the Mosaic law is the cause of death and what's going on, I think what the Valentinians imagine is that once the Demiurge starts commanding things, and the Demiurge begins commanding things literally as soon as they're human beings. Do this, don't eat that. Noah seems to know what animals are clean and unclean before the Mosaic law has been revealed. There's an idea in Judaism that the Torah is constantly being revealed, and that at Sinai you get the big reveal, you get all of it, but that God sort of like revealing it like piecemeal up until then, so that there are certain kinds of rules that Noah knew, and already God in the Hebrew Bible saying don't eat this, don't eat that, and so maybe the idea was that as soon as the legislating began, which began at the very beginning of human beings' existence, that's when death entered the world. So I think that's what the Valentinians would say, but I never see them address it. And that was my sort of, maybe folks know this on the channel. When I go to a question, I try to always assume that the people doing it were smart, and Valentinus was certainly smart. And I think that must have been something like his answer. It's not just the Mosaic law in the Bible, but it's the legislating of the Demiurge that introduces death.
You say the Demiurge in the Valentinian conception, strikes me as a well-meaning but very disconnected parent.
Yeah, it's a great example. They're doing their best. I mean, and I love the idea of the Mosaic law. And again, being Jewish, this is not exactly how I think about it, but I love the idea was that it was like that was the best he could come up with. Like he had a psychic nature, he gave psychic rules, and that's still better than giving into the Hylic nature, and that it was limited but still better than do whatever you want, which is clearly bad. So yeah, it's the Demiurge, the Valentinian Demiurge, is a highly sympathetic character. And again, this is also points to the thing I was talking about earlier, where it's not really clear after the universe was created. That whole process very much seems to be driven by Sophia controlling him. But it seems like after that, he's kind of an autonomous character, and that would make sense given that the psychic, the Suke is related to free will. And so it seems like after Sophia has used the cunning of her reason to create the world, he's kind of a free agent now. And so I think that thinking of him as a sort of a ignorant robot is not quite correct, but more so true at the beginning of the process than now, especially now that he's seen the whole truth and is out there fighting the devil on our behalf. So thank you, Valentinian Demiurge.
Follow-up question. We've got about 5 minutes, so folks have a question, stick your hand up now. But I've always wondered this, the kind of threefold categorization of humanity after a fact. People, and I mean here you're dealing with 2 or 3 rings out, because I don't think people who have had these discussions have necessarily dived into primary stuff. I mean, that includes me. But, at least in kind of formal Gnostic or informal Gnostic or esoteric aligned kind of communities and spaces, when the threefold division of humanity comes up, there becomes the question of whether or not those categories are fixed.
Right.
If somebody is born psychic, can they progress in this lifetime to pneumatic, or is it just something that happens, as a result of reincarnation or rebirth? And also the follow-up, and I think this is a question that we discussed with Dr. Plasia, is whether or not, at least on the Sethian thing, whether or not there was kind of a universalist view, in the sense of salvation, that over the course of a lifetime or several lifetimes, that eventually it's going to work itself out. So I guess I would ask, do you think those categories are fixed or changeable, or?
I think the Valentinian texts are quite confused on the matter. I think some of them seem to have the idea that you're born into one of the 3 categories, but it seems like some other texts, which I think are actually closer, I think, to Valentinian's system, is that the human being is the nexus of all 3, and that the psychic element allows us to choose between our Hylic or spiritual natures, and that everyone has to do that. And it's very much like the Yetzer Hara versus the Yetzer HaTov idea in Judaism, that you have these 2 inclinations, and that free will is what allows you to pick one. And that seems much more authentic to me to the actual spirit of the Valentinian system, insofar as creation is, again, sort of a theater of salvation. And there is a case that all of humanity the entire spiritual seed will eventually be saved. And that inaugurates the end for Valentinus. That is the end of, and in fact, I think you get the sense in then in the Valentinian system, it's coming quite soon. It's going to be, it's all going to be wrapping up rather soon. And so, yeah, when I read it, I don't read it as sort of a Valentinus' system is sort of like Gnostic Calvinism. Either you're predestined to one or the other. I don't read it that way. Yeah, so I'm with Penny there. I don't really read that as sort of Gnostic Calvinism. I think it is the universal salvation is in the cards. I think that's what the whole Valentinian system is up to, and it seems like it's more authentically, and again, much more close to Plato. And it seems like Valentinus is much more comfortable with Platonism, and that's definitely where Plato is that we're all able to use, wrangle the chariot of our souls to ride it all the way into the forms, and that strikes me as much more close to the spirit of Valentinus.
Good stuff. Thank you. We got two more questions, and then we'll have to wrap. And I was going to say, if the Demiurge and Co. are going to, roll things up, I go back to work on Thursday, so anytime before that would be nice. I don't want to go back to work. And yes, we're always in for a daily Calvin bashing, as Jeb noted. So Penny, go for it.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could say anything else about the implicit comparison between William Blake and this specific version of the Demiurge. Like I'm kind of wondering, because our reason can't be entirely bad in the same way that this Demiurge is not bad.
Right.
Is there anything you can say about that?
It's a great question. And William Blake's enormously complex system. Yeah, I think the point is that your reason in the William Blakean system is just limited. That insofar as we rely on reason alone, then we're not focusing on the fullness of who we are. And Blake's system really wants to have emotion and, sort of the classic romantic stuff be liberatory, passion and all that stuff. And I think that a kind of enlightened passion, is kind of what is what's motivating all of this, right? Remember that what motivates Sophia is this sort of enlightened, a sort of unenlightened passion, then an enlightened passion. And I think that there could be an inroad made where the Blakean system, which is very much animated by passion, especially again, sort of enlightened passion, could be grafted onto the Valentinian system in a quite elegant way. So yeah, I think one could do that and generate some really lovely stuff. Because again, you notice that emotion plays such a negative role in the Valentinian system, with the exception of things like Sophia's laughter. I love the fact that her laughter becomes part of the rite. That becomes sort of some of the psychic stuff. Is that and so she has these moments where, and I'm sure we've all felt it, right? Where you've had a day so bad that you just burst out laughing. That's Sophia Achamout's day. She's cast out of the pleroma, and she just rages until she can't rage anymore. And what she do? She sort of bangs her head on the steering wheel and just starts laughing. And her laugh becomes this beautiful part of how the psychic substance is formed. So I think one could extend that laugh into something a bit more romantic and a bit more joyful, and really incorporate some lovely Blakean stuff in there.
Thank you.
Last question comes from the chat. It's from Bishop Scott. It says, you mentioned the devil and demons arise from matter. Are they self-generating or fallen angels, or just a product of the mixing of psychic, hylic, and pneumatic?
It's a good question, and I don't have a good answer for this because the Valentinian texts really never tell you exactly how they get formed. Whether they're auto-generated from matter, in the way that medieval people or ancient people thought of as bees being generated from the carcasses of animals, or worms being generated from cheese. They could be auto-generated, but they also could have been made by the Demiurge as just sort of a necessary feature of this entire system, right? That in the same way that you just can't have matter without having demons. But I never got when my reading of Valentinus's material, which this Valentinus reader is really great, I never got a clear sense of where they came from exactly. And in some sense, they seem kind of shoehorned in, you don't really even need them. But maybe, again, just as matter does represent, pure matter represents evil, then that is going to be just an active force in the Valentinian system. But I don't have a great answer as to exactly how they got formed. That's not clear to me.
Well, thank you kindly. This was a fantastic talk, a fantastic discussion. We've been putting up our conclave videos for decade and a half or so, and I've usually got a good sense on which ones are going to become an instant classic. And I think, I know I've said it once before, but this will be on that list. This was a great talk. Thank you for to do this. I love it. And we've got lots of esoterica fans, both in here and then in the wider church.
I really appreciate it. What I'll do is I'll throw a link to this in the chat if folks want to have access to the slideshow. Sometimes people like that, but it's totally up to you guys if you want to use it. But again, I just want to say as we wrap up, I really thank you so much for having me. It's really amazing to be able to use my academic background in service of a faith community. It's a real honor for me. So thank you so much for the invitation, and I hope the rest of the talks go well, and I'll see folks or maybe around Esoterica land.
We might also have our first schism as part of the church breaks off to become strictly Valentinian.
Oh, then you have to pick out who's going to become Eastern and Western Valentinians. You have to really get into the arguments about where exactly did Jesus and the Holy Spirit come from. I love that granular stuff.
There's an old friend of mine who once said over cheeseburgers, and it stuck with me, and this was like 20 years ago, where there's an ism, there's a schism.
Yes, it's true. Yeah. I always say, the way that we do it in Judaism is that we just they're all in the same shul, right? Folks know this joke. I'll maybe tell this joke very quickly. You have the Jew that builds he gets on a desert island, right? He gets marooned. They find him years later. He's built 2 synagogues, and they say, "Why did you build 2 synagogues?" And he says, "Well, one of them I pray in, and the other I won't set foot in. So help me God."
That reminds me of, okay, I got to tell one, and then we got to go because we got 5 minutes to our next thing. The old joke about the Catholics don't recognize the Anglicans don't recognize the Lutherans don't recognize the Baptists, and the Baptists don't recognize each other at the liquor store.
That's a good one. This is fantastic.
That's an oldie.
That's a good one. All right. Thank you so much, guys. And you have a great rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.